Okay, let's get back to our discussions now. We're going to do a panel discussion. This time there won't be keynote speeches. We'll just invite our panelists up onto the stage and we'll get straight on with our conversation. This one it's about, well, what is loosely defined as blue growth. That is looking at the economy around the ocean, all that goes with it. We're calling it healthy and productive ocean, sustaining blue growth in the Arctic. So I'm going to call up all of our panelists. Don't applaud each one, just give them a big round of applause when they've all made it up onto the stage. So let's have Peter Thompson, who is the UN Secretary General Special Envoy for the Ocean, Jenna Jambek, who is from the University of Georgia, researcher in this field, Jonas Gahr Støre, who many of you will know is former Foreign Minister of Norway and leader of the Labour Party, Anja Bakken-Riise, who is from the Fremtiden I Våre Hender, I'm sure I've pronounced that wrong, but the environmental group in Norway, Mike Fraga, who is head of the Polar Initiative at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and Edil Elvevold, Dean of the Fisheries Department here at the Arctic University of Norway, Tromsø University. So there we go, our panel, ladies and gentlemen. And panelists, you don't get the luxury of a keynote presentation, but I'm going to start with a very broad opening question, and each of you can have a go at it with your different perspectives. We're talking now about the oceans, about this so-called notion of blue growth. How can we develop ocean-based industries at the same time as ensuring a smaller negative footprint from those industries? Can it be done, and if so, how? So let's start with you, and we'll come down the panel.
Yeah, the Arctic Ocean is still not vastly studied, it's not monitored, it's not done all the research that has to be done before we could start utilizing all these potentials that we have been talking about, at least in the session beforehand. There is created a roadmap for the development through the Fairbanks Declaration, although not ratified. I think that's a good roadmap to start to get the knowledge to really exploit the Arctic Ocean. We need some more knowledge about what footprint, how the ecosystems thrive, and we need to be able to get all the researchers to cooperate, to move freely in the Arctic, and we need to let them, help them to share data, and we need to the declaration also puts some emphasis to education and training, and of course that's really necessary to be exploiting the Arctic. I think the high Arctic we are talking about just now. And since the Fairbanks Declaration is not yet ratified, I think it's interesting that the Arctic Science Ministerial meeting in October will focus on the same areas, how to get people cooperating, sharing, to get the knowledge that we need to exploit the Arctic for all the resources. The fishery resources, we have a good management on the Norwegian behalf in the Norwegian seas, but when we are starting with mining or exploiting of energy and things like that, high north, we don't have or tourism or transportation, and we don't really have the knowledge that's needed to do these things.
As fisheries is your thing, Edda, what lessons can be learned from fishery management in the Arctic?
The things that we could learn from the fisheries is that tight monitoring, and then cooperation through the border states, the ones that are going to exploit the resources, and then the regulations, and then put it into place so it could be managed in a sustainable way. And you have a niveau on each species that you could take out. And in the future, we of course hope that we could do multi-species ecosystem-based management. And with the development of the digitalization, the big data and all those things, I'm sure that we will be able to do that in just a few years.
Okay.
And in the Arctic, there's a lot of animals or plants and things like that we could utilize for biopharma, for feed to the farming industry, and so on and so forth. But of course, all the time we are exploiting these things. We have to look at the challenges from the environmental point of view.
All right. Jenna, I'm just going to go down the panel. So Jenna, you next. It does, in the end, come back to something that I was talking about at the very beginning of the day, which is, the proposition that in the Arctic, there's perhaps a hope, if not a belief, that one can have it all. One can have significant, sustained economic growth and development while acknowledging the sustainability agenda and delivering it in a way that respects everything that's important about the environment up here. And is it, in other spheres of life, people conclude you can't have it all, but
right.
Can you have it here?
That's a great question. I think we need to be more proactive and less sort of reactive about the environment. So what I've seen as an environmental engineer, and I really sort of focus on solid waste management, that we've seen this large boom in urban development and economic growth. And everyone's been really excited about that, and rightfully so. But we have let our environmental infrastructure to support that growth lag behind. And so then we've seen problems and had to address them later. So I think if you can be more proactive, and specifically I can give an example from my research, and that's the economic growth and lack of solid waste management infrastructure. And that has actually led to a lot of our waste, specifically plastic, which has grown so tremendously in the last couple decades.
And is that affecting the Arctic oceans in a very obvious way now? Because we see what they call the garbage patches in the Pacific Ocean, vast swathes of water just covered in horrible debris, plastics and everything else. And then there's it degrades and it becomes microplastic.
Exactly.
So on both of those things, the visible and the invisible, how's the Arctic faring?
Yeah. So, it's been seen here for many years, actually, in the depths and in sea ice, and of course, as we have ice melting and climate change happening, that could release more of the microplastic. We think that maybe the Arctic could actually be sort of a sink for some of the microplastic.
Really?
It can travel up from the North Atlantic Sea
the currents
into the Arctic.
In that direction, are they? They're actually gathering the stuff in the Arctic.
So we think that some researchers have hypothesized that it might actually be a sink for this microplastic. So it's impacted globally, not just in the Arctic, but as economic growth happens here, I think being proactive is what we need to be about the environment.
Right. What do you see on the ground right now amongst the Arctic nations? How much real awareness and willingness to act in the way that you'd like?
Yeah, well, pretty recently there's been a working group in the Arctic Council trying to address solid waste management issues. There's a new sort of initiative under the working group that's the protection of Arctic marine environment. So they've started a marine debris and microplastic desk study that's going to be happening over the next few years. So I think they're on the right track, but I've also seen economic growth happen even faster than 2 to 3 years. So I think it's happening in parallel right now.
Right. Let me bring Peter Thompson in now. He's the UN SecGen's Special Envoy for the Ocean. Looking from the point of view of the UN, an overview of global action, where does the Arctic figure in your list of sort of concerns for our marine environment?
Okay, well, first of all, when we talk about blue economy, we've got to talk about sustainable blue economy. It's very important, obviously, to all of us. But without that word sustainable in front of it, we're killing the goose that lays the golden egg. because the blue economy is forecasted to be extremely important to humanity going forward. OECD has calculated that the sustainable blue economy will add 100% to what its current value is by 2030. The researchers show that we could get all the protein we need as a species from the ocean, particularly with advanced and improved aquaculture, et cetera, et cetera. But we must be taking that precautionary principle to its highest level, whether we're talking about seabed mining or whether we're talking about fishing in the Arctic. We have to take that precautionary principle as our starting point and make the bar high. And in that regard, I was very pleased to see the other day the 16 nations that have an interest in Arctic fishing put in that 16-year moratorium where there will be no fishing in the Central Arctic Ocean for 16 years, while marine science is given a chance to go out and find out what the situation actually is. So that's really important that the precautionary principle is applied not just the Arctic, everywhere.
Because the precautionary principle doesn't just mean think about it before you do it. It can mean don't do it at all.
Well, if science shows you that, but you have to, of course, apply the science to be able to take those sort of decisions. So the good news there is that a month ago in the United Nations General Assembly passed the resolution bringing into place the International Decade for Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. First time that we will really focus properly, and when I say we, I mean all of us, on what is out there in the ocean. I mean, we know less about what's down in the ocean than we do about what's on the face of the moon or the face of Mars. So we've got that decade coming up, and that's really good news.
And what about the levels of cooperation in the Arctic? The UN, you at the UN, you take an active interest in it. Then there's the Arctic Council, and there's the EU. It takes an interest in what's happening in the high north. Are you pleased with what you see in terms of international cooperation? And
I think it's generally well accepted. The Arctic Council has been doing a very good job. And the international community is very supportive of what's being done, yeah.
Okay. Let's get the perspective of a Norwegian politician, foreign minister and party leader, and Norway very proud of its oceans and its record, but Norway also a country that is very committed to developing its fishing industry, is, as we've heard through the course of today, very still convinced that oil and gas is a very important part of your economic future. You're trying to juggle different plates or keep them spinning in the air at the same time. Is that actually going to become increasingly difficult?
Well, that's not only Norway's dilemma, it's the world's dilemma. We have to find an answer to how we can do sustainable economy at large. And I think Norway has experienced that we can be at the forefront of Arctic development by having ideas, knowledge, and try to put them into practice. I think there are three elements here relating to the Arctic, as you raise, which I think is a huge opportunity because we have to do both. We have to extract from the oceans proteins and living materials for a growing population, and we have to protect a threatened species, which is the oceans. And the Arctic can lead on this, I believe, and there are three reasons for it. First, there are responsible coastal states. And that's absolutely key to ocean management, that there are responsible coastal states. In 2008, we adopted the Ilulissat Declaration, where all the Arctic states really subscribed to the law of the sea. And out of that, we can have agreements as we just had on fishing, and we have on the Arctic Council numerous working groups. And
sorry to interrupt, but you're convinced that all of the Arctic states are living up, it's quite a long time since 2008, it's almost 10 years.
Yeah, but
are they all, and we're talking now about the United States, now led by Donald Trump, we're talking about Russia, led by Vladimir Putin. These states, having signed a piece of paper in 2008, are all living up to their commitments, are they?
Well, I take that as a step. I mean, the US has not ratified the Convention of the Law of the Sea, but normally respects it. I believe that Norway and Russia in this part of the Arctic have a special role because we are responsible coastal states that have demonstrated management of the cod in a way which I think the world can learn from. But that's the first thing. You need responsible coastal states that take responsibility. Secondly, I think we in Norway have practiced comprehensive management plans which put together knowledge and interactions between all kinds of ocean life, and we make it sustainable. We strive towards making it sustainable. And that is a model which I experienced as foreign minister, that there was a great interest globally in how these comprehensive management plans actually are developed. It's a boring name, but it's pretty exciting when you go to the inside of it. And the third element is that I believe that these Arctic coastal states, with their ability to strike deals that really respond to the challenges there in the oceans, can come up with new research, new knowledge. The problem with plastics in the Arctic, as we know, it may be a sink, but whereas plastics out there in the oceans often come from mainland, we know that up in the north it basically comes from transport and shipping. So that is my last element. If we are going to tackle these challenges, we have to bring economics into it. And here in Tromsø City now, the mayor, who I just met before coming here, is saying that we want to make Tromsø plastic-free.
Right.
And I believe this is an issue which 10 years ago people, generally were not aware as they are now. But school classes along Norway's coast are saying, we don't want it. We want to clean it up. We want to make our coast safe. So for that to really happen, we have to make an economic logic. For those with litter, they will have an interest of delivering it somewhere, and there will be somebody there at the shore who will pick it up, recycle, and make some products out of it. So we have to bring sound economics into that cleaning up operation. Because if we don't do that, I don't think we will simply manage.
I don't know if you were here earlier for our session on connectivity and transportation and infrastructure, but the vision for the ambitious increase in shipping traffic through these sort of, I think the Northeast Passage we call it, in the Arctic Ocean, and connecting Asia and Europe through the Arctic. It's hugely ambitious, in some ways quite exciting, but also in terms of this blue growth commitment, extremely concerning, is it?
It is very concerning, and I mean 10 years ago, or in 2005, when I became foreign minister, we talked about an ocean-free Arctic in the end of this century. And now it is there for the 2030s. So it is really turning it upside down.
So you mean an ice-free?
Ice-free.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are opportunities here, ice-free, you're right.
Yeah.
There are opportunities for transport, but of course huge challenges, because there's still going to be ice, it's still going to be Arctic winter, it's still going to be dark winters, and a great danger from management. But there again, I believe, in the Arctic, they are responsible coastal states, and they have to tie themselves to obligations that need to be monitored as modern treaties. And here I believe the Arctic can really show the way to large other areas of the global ocean community on how you can make regional deals. And this deal on fishing that was mentioned, I think is a great step in that direction. And while I mentioned 2008 and the Ilulissat Declaration, it was so important because it really proved what you can pull out of the Treaty of the Law of the Sea. It has all the tools. It had the tools for Norway and Russia to conclude delimitation line in the Arctic Sea, Barents Sea. All the tools are there. So, coastal states have the tools to make a difference if they are enlightened and if they are, seeking the right cooperation.
All right. Well, we so far definitely have a half glass full panel, not a half glass empty panel. But Anja Bakken-Riis, if we can come to you, I believe that the translation of your group's title in English is Future in Our Hands. So tell me what you think of what you're hearing. Are you a glass half full sort of woman when it comes to blue growth and how it, you can have it all to a certain extent, as some of our panel appear to believe?
Well, I think it's important for us to divide this discussion in two, because we're talking about a sustainable blue economy, and that's one issue. But it's a whole other issue when we're talking about the Arctic and how to do things in the Arctic. And there are particular precautions that we have to take when it comes to economic activity in the Arctic.
You mean the Arctic is special and shouldn't be just lumped together with all the other oceans?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we know that global warming is happening faster in the Arctic than anywhere else on the planet. We know that that the vulnerable ecosystems in the Arctic are really strained now because of the ice melting. We know that it's pretty much everything that we do everywhere else in the world ends up kind of in the Arctic. It's not their fault, but it ends up there. We're talking about plastic and microplastic. It's the same thing with environmental toxins
It sort of is their fault.
and
Why
chemicals.
it is their fault, but anyway, I guess that's a different debate.
Environmental toxins that we use in our consumer products end up in the sea, being eaten by small planktons, being eaten by shells, being eaten by fish, walrus, polar bears. It all ends up on top of the chain in the Arctic, which means that we have to take particular precaution. Well, actually, it's a strong case for a very strong climate policy in general, and for not continuing the global warming by burning more fossil fuels and exploring for more oil and burning more oil in general. But it's a particularly strong argument when it comes to the Arctic because of its extreme vulnerability. So there's you know, we can talk about the sustainable blue economy, but there are special
I
precautions
get the
when we
point
talk
that
about the Arctic.
the Arctic region is clearly showing visible signs of its extreme vulnerability, but nonetheless, you know, 4 million, as it's been pointed out several times during today, 4 million people make their livelihoods up here. There is scope, given the amazing resources this region has, for managed development to both give jobs and future prospects to the people who already live here, but also to actually, frankly, look forward to more people living here, because it makes sense in a planet where this is one of the most sparsely populated regions in the world for actually a few more people to live up here. So your message would seem to be, oh my God, global warming is so awful in the Arctic that we ought to just kind of stop everything, when...
Not at all. I mean, we have to take very special precaution when it comes to the Arctic. But I think our deputy mayor here in Tromsø said something earlier that was very clever. We're talking about resources, but some of the best resources we have here comes, for instance, from research and innovation, and it doesn't have to be the continued exploration of oil and gas. And that would be perhaps my main or key message when we're talking about economic activity in the Arctic in particular. But when we're talking about sustainable blue economy, as with all kinds of other sustainable economic activity, I would say that there are 3 areas where if you're supposed to do your business sustainably, that you have to pay special attention. And the one is to analyze and report on climate risk, and I can dwell on that for a bit, but there's the issue of climate risk, there's the issue of decarbonization, and there's the issue of introducing a more circular economy to your business model. And when we're talking about climate risk, and this is the same for within the blue economy and general activity in other business sectors, we're talking about analyzing will this business model be a resilient business in a Paris Agreement scenario, in a decarbonized economy? So we're talking about the transitional risk with the introduction of new environmental, with new renewable energy. What will happen with your business model? And I think for all of us, we can see that with the exploration of oil and gas in the Arctic, we In Norway, we just opened up for more exploration in the Arctic, and if we find new areas that might be possible to drill and explore, it will at the earliest be available for production in 2030. And in 2030, 5 years ago, we will have stopped selling fossil fuel run cars. All the big businesses are introducing EVs, electrical vehicles. We are in part of a shift that I think everyone sees but might not acknowledge how it will affect our business in general. And I think that there's not going to be so much interest in this expensive and hazardous oil that you'll find in the Arctic.
You've delivered that salutary message looking at me, but in some ways I wish you'd been looking at the minister or former foreign minister over there. But before I allow you to pick up on that, because you raised some really interesting points, I do want to introduce everybody to Mike Fraga as well, because Mike, you bring a perspective from the United States into all of this, but I know you work for a polar initiative. You spend a lot of time thinking about the Arctic. What's your take on this notion of whether the Arctic can find this sweet spot of sustained growth, major sort of development and investment opportunity, but doing it in a way that is truly, rather than just using it as a greenwash word, is truly sustainable?
Yeah, I'm actually quite positive about the future. The fact that you have the Arctic Council, EU, and other frameworks at work, having meetings like this, talking about it, subgroups set up, subcommittees set up. I agree there needs to be more research-based, science-driven decision-making, but the fact that there are frameworks already built that are looking at the future of the Arctic is a bit hopeful to me, as opposed to just going in and developing a piece of land or new real estate. We have a new ocean emerging before us, and so we have a lot of analysis to be done, but I'm quite optimistic that we can strike some balance. Having said that, you have competing interests. This is globalization in real time happening. Shipping routes, oil and gas development, on fisheries. These are not just the Arctic 8 nations or the 5 coastal nations of the Arctic. This is the globe coming to the Arctic. It's no longer emerging. It has emerged. The egg is cracked, the chicken is out, it's done. We are now part of the global political discussions, economic discussions elsewhere. For the state of Alaska that I live in, we are totally dependent on oil. 85% of our income comes from one resource we never diversified. And so we know there's a transition, at least in the state of Alaska, that we've got to get off this oil for a while. But until decades out, that's the one
Sure
resource.
isn't the message we're getting from Washington right now.
I agree. And so you will find some themes that are consistent with what's coming out of the White House and what many Alaskans feel, which is resource development. However, you have indigenous peoples who rely on this ocean to live. They have the land shifting under them literally from permafrost melt. So it's like a Russian nesting doll of issues, that oil and gas development for a state like mine is dependent on drilling. However, the impacts of climate change are destroying the very permafrost and the landscape that we rest upon, and we depend on these oceans, not just as a sport fisherman, but for a way of life.
And it's not even just the permafrost, but I not so long ago was in communities which are coastal communities in the high north, which are having to move because of rising sea levels.
So I just had at the Wilson Center 4 elders from the village of Newtok. Newtok has about a year and a half left. This is in southwest Alaska. They've got about a year and a half left. They're going to have to move 400 people 9 miles or so upriver. It would cost about $130 million to move those 400 people. Now, the land that they will move to is more solid, but they're seeing it's not just permafrost melt, but it's storm surge because the ocean ice is no longer there.
Do you think science and scientists are effectively communicating the realities of change in the ocean and in the Arctic, or could they do a better job? Anybody can feel free to. Yeah.
I think they made a great difference in the first 10 years of this century, leading up to the IPCC and the major conclusions. Clarion calls to that study came from the Arctic Assessment Impact Study.
Yeah.
I think one of the very promising things now is the agreement on research that has been concluded at Fairbanks, and that there will be an infrastructure put in place really to extract that knowledge, which, as you said rightfully, concerns 4 million people, but it is really global in its message. So I think, to come back to your answer about research on oil and gas is not the most exciting thing about the Arctic and resources. It's really, in my view, about feeding the world. And how we're going to develop technologies that can feed a growing world populations with proteins in a way which is sustainable. And we just start to discover, as this was mentioned, the enormous potential. We know more about the surface of the moon than the seabed of the oceans. So there's so much knowledge that we need to extract. And then, there can both be opportunities for jobs, sustainable activities, but then we have to do the hard work, which is to put that research infrastructure in place, make the commitments nationally through our universities and research centers, empower them with resources and the best brains, and then I think the Arctic really can lead on this.
Right.
Really can lead on this.
I'll come back to fish, if I may, because fish are hugely important. Both have always been important to the indigenous communities, but now very important, as you say, potentially to feeding the world in the future, using the seas as sort of, to crop the seas, if you can put it that way. But isn't the message from some of the initiatives, particularly in intensive fish farming, that it hasn't been terribly well managed, and it can be extremely damaging to the environment and actually produce fish which aren't even very good for us to eat, nowhere near as nutritious as wild fish. So while, yes, there's huge potential in farming the seas, we can screw it up very easily.
Yeah, of course we can. There are challenges, and we have seen the escapees and the sea lice and all the things that we are troubling with in Norway just now, and we have halted the development of the aquaculture industry for some years, but the researchers are working to try to figure out how to deal with these things. The other thing is that, of course, I look at the Barents Sea as a huge food storage for years to come, and both the fish and also all the other animals that live there. We have nowadays we have a really interesting project at our university where we are trying to cultivate algae from the northernmost ice-free parts. It's a diatomeric algae. This algae can double its biomass from one day to the other. God help us if we could. The algae thrive at low temperatures, it thrive at low light intensities, and it thrive with almost no nutrients that the rest of the people who's living here. So
what are we going to do with all this algae?
The algae is producing protein, it's producing marine lipids, it's producing all the healthy materials that you are getting from eating fish and seafood normally.
So we're all going to eat algae paste in the future?
No, the other thing is that we could eat algae paste if we were to, or we could feed the salmon with the algae, or we could diversify the farming industry and have some more different fishes into the farming system of Norway. So there's really lots of potentials in the blue economy in Norway. And the deputy mayor was talking about the work that's been done into bioprospecting, looking after unique molecules, unique chemistry, unique genes that you could use for different things. He was talking of alkaline phosphatase, and that's used in molecular development that we are seeing all over the world. So there's really huge potentials looking into all the organisms that are here. They have adapted to low temperature, dark, really harsh conditions. So there's really a lot of potential. But as we speak of that, I still want to emphasize that we need to take the precaution. Norway has just now, or are in the process of launching a big program that's the Nansen Legacy. Norway is going to use 740 million Norwegian kroner, that's 110 US, I think, to look at the ecosystem, how they are thriving with the changes that are getting through, and how we could do things in a sustainable manner, and to get better weather forecast. I mean, the changes that we are seeing in the Arctic just now, they are perhaps really have an impact on the world weather.
Yeah.
So we really need to not do only this big program in Norway. We need a pan-Arctic big program to do the research and to do the job,
All right.
to be able to model the system.
Good. Well, you put lots of ideas out there, and I thank you for that. What I'm going to do now is actually just tap into the expertise I'm sure there is in the audience, knowledge of marine and Arctic issues and blue growth and all that goes with it. So I'm going to open it up to questions, and I'm going to start with you, sir. So let's get a microphone down to the front area here, and we'll, if you would just stand up and give us your name, and then a quick question.
Thank you so much. My name is Hunter. I'm a PhD student at Dartmouth in the United States, and I study the governance challenges of Greenland small-scale fisheries. And the Mohn Prize earlier indicates very much so that small-scale fisheries are part of the Arctic. And according to the UN, almost 50% of all fish that are caught come from the small-scale sector. And of all the people who work in the fishery sector, 90% are in the small-scale sector as fishers or fish workers. So I'm curious to know if, in your opinions, if there is a role for small-scale fisheries in the development of the blue economy, given that there are some debates around the efficiency of small-scale fisheries in the face of aquaculture and large-scale fishing. Is it anachronistic to have small-scale fishers be part of this in the future, or do we see them dissolving? So thank you.
Yeah, good question.
Well, I think it is absolutely fundamental because it is part of the backbone of our coastal culture. And if we were to think that industrial fishing will do the trick because they can amass the fish, freeze it, and sell it to markets, we are killing that coastal culture, which is so important to achieve all the other elements. So I believe a modern coastal state should really be careful about protecting its coastal fishery communities. It is really about maintaining a cultural, long tradition of sustainable approaches to fishing, combining that with modern.
I mean, I think the argument has to go deeper than that, doesn't it? I mean, for example, in the UK, we used to have tens, if not hundreds of thousands of coal miners who lived in traditional coal mining communities, which for generations had been devoted to digging coal out of the ground. And they were very proud of their heritage and their history and their culture and community. Almost all of those communities are now dead, gone, finished. And that's because Britain no longer produces coal.
Yeah, but Norway will continue to produce fish.
But for local, yeah, but just for their own consumption. But if they're not the most efficient way of producing fish for the national and international marketplace, why continue to insist that subsidies and other forms of support have to be given to them?
Because we are communities. We are political communities, and we have a political will behind that. And one element in Norway is that natural resources are owned by the communities, by people. And that means that if we untie the link between resources out there in the ocean and people living on shore, we break some of those bearing elements on what makes us a community. Right. So we can still make a combination of very advanced fish farming that can move into the oceans out from the fjords, still have industrial trawling, but we will have a coastal fleet of a limited size, which will continue to provide fish to local communities that will have a fishing industry, which is maybe, you know, on some scales less efficient from large-scale efficiency, but from a perspective of maintaining community, knowledge, and developing these elements that are so key to explore. Because you mentioned fish, which is the top part of the pyramid of what we start to discover is there in the sea. And I believe that if we do away with these coastal communities, we will also do away with the access and the research drive to understand what happens at the great depth.
But it's a very interesting answer, and you're saying, in essence, it's not all about economics. It's social and cultural policy as well as economic policy. It's the holistic approach to communities and people.
It comes back to your former prime minister who said that there is no such thing as a community. There's only men and women.
Well,
and in my view, there
no
is
such thing as society. But anyway.
No, but I mean, this is linked. I believe, in order, I started talking about responsible coastal states. And what makes us a coastal state? It's that we have people, 80% of Norwegians live less than 1 hour from the coast. And if we cut the tie between what it means living by the coast and harvesting at the oceans, we lose our cultural heritage, and then we can forget about exploring.
Okay. Peter, you wanted to say something, then we'll move
just
on.
In answer to the question about small-scale fisheries. Firstly, I'd say, it's always dangerous just to think about one area. We're talking about the Arctic here. I mean, there is only one ocean. Things that happen up here affect us in the South Pacific, vice versa. The universality of the ocean is the thing that we must remember in all these discussions we're having this week. So what do we have in terms of universality as a species on this planet? If we have the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the Paris Agreement. That's all we've got. Even UNCLOS is not universal. Venezuela, Turkey, US, and a few others haven't signed it. But SDG 14, everybody bought into that in September 2015. There's been no backtracking. SDG 14 is the plan to save the ocean. And for anybody that hasn't heard the bad news, the ocean is in decline, whether it's acidification or warming or deoxygenation or declining fish stocks or degraded coastal ecosystems or marine pollution at unconscionable levels. It is in decline. And the Arctic will not be spared that if we don't implement SDG 14. SDG 14 is the good news. That's the plan to save the ocean. And interestingly, of the 10 targets of SDG 14, one is artisanal fishers must be given access to markets, because we recognize their importance in the overall mix. Because this is not just about Norwegians or Fijians. This is about billions of people out there who depend on fisheries, and a lot of them are fishermen who they and their families depend on that. Thanks.
Just one, I want to get back to our audience questions. Well, I remember seeing a report on the BBC just a few weeks ago, and it was on the BBC, so it must be true. It was based in the Pacific. They have developed new machinery, vast, great big sort of machines the size of dinosaurs with huge flails that can basically mine underwater. Underwater mining is becoming a really big deal now. And there are some very precious minerals, that are in high concentration. I think this particular report was particularly interested in what's happening off the coast of Papua New Guinea and some places like that, where mining operations are actually beginning underwater. But is that the sort of, I dare say, given the amount of resource that we know of in the landmass of the Arctic, that under the Arctic Ocean, there's some extraordinarily valuable minerals for all sorts of new technologies. One day, will those inevitably be mined?
My answer to you would probably be yes. I was president of the International Seabed Authority for 2 years. The good news is that precautionary principle that we were talking about is really being put to work in Jamaica, where the headquarters of the International Seabed Authority is. But there is so much wealth down there, particularly in polymetallic nodules, but also in the sulfides, that it will... if we want cell phones, we may have to go there. And it could be that there is going to be less pollution arising from getting our minerals from there than there is in opening another mine in the Amazon somewhere to get those minerals. But the message that is, there is not yet law to allow anybody to extract minerals from the high seas seabed, which is the majority of the world's seabed. There's not yet law.
You're saying that
but
is
the
coming.
Law is very nearly ready. We've been working on it for about 6
when
years.
The Norwegian you're not Norwegian Prime Minister, and some would say that's a shame, but anyway, you're not at the moment. But who knows, one day you might be, and if you imagine yourself a Norwegian Prime Minister, and you receive a big fat report which says Norway is unbelievably rich in underwater minerals which could feed the global mobile phone, smartphone industry for years to come, make Norway unimaginable riches to compare with what it's received from oil and gas. would you as Norwegian PM grab that and say, fantastic, our future is made, or would you immediately exercise a massive dose of precautionary principle? And let's be honest.
I don't think it would have to be massive. I think it would have to be in line with what we have, I think, rather successfully done thus far. First of all, I believe that from excluding the mining, but rather from what you find in the oceans, we find the same figures in our own research as the OECD, that our oil economy will start its decline, but the oceans will provide compensation for that richly if we do it wisely. And I believe that in the future you can do mining at sea, but you will have to do it with precautionary principle, strong regulations, licenses, and what we have applied when we are doing mining at sea already in Norway, which is oil and gas. We have the techniques. Yeah. And why could we do that in 1970 and onwards? Because we had managed licenses for hydro water electricity 90 years earlier, or 70 years earlier. So we had a system of regulations. So you cannot venture into this as a kind of Wild West, which is the danger at the open sea, outside the coastal states. But that's why I come back to my point. It is so key that the coastal states that have their 200 nautical miles and a bit beyond are responsible, are kept to account, and take the lead on developing legislations beyond, as we would have to do with mining.
Okay. All right. Let's see if we can get more questions from our audience. Who would like to raise a question or make a point for our panel on all of these issues concerning so-called blue growth? Who would like to raise a hand? Am I being blind, or are no hands actually in the air right now? It's a bit like being an auctioneer. I'm looking for bids and I've got a bid. Come on, sir, give us your name and your question.
Yeah, my name is Jan Gunnar Winter. I'm a specialist director at the Norwegian Polar Institute. I guess my question goes to Peter Thomsen. I agree with the Labour Party leader Jonas Gahr Støre about the responsibility for the coastal states, but we know about 56% of the ocean is high seas. How optimistic are you for the world solving the governance issues connected to the high seas?
Yeah, good
well,
question.
Firstly, for the seabed, I think it's probably the best governed part of the world, number one. And the reason for that is UNCLOS set up the International Seabed Authority, and anybody who's gone out and explored in the high seas seabed has had to have a license from the International Seabed Authority. So that's the seabed.
How do you get there? I mean,
it's
how does that work?
Very rigorous, very rigorous. There's a council, there's an assembly, there's a very strong procedure they have to go through. You have to get a sponsoring state for if you're a company that wants to. It's very rigorous.
It truly hasn't been infected with what we see at the UN and so many international organizations of sort of, politics intervening and different big powers playing off against each other.
Hand on heart.
Doesn't happen.
It doesn't happen. We know where the minerals are, and it's not in large parts of the seabed. It's concentrated. Right. So that's where the exploration licenses have been given. No exploitation licenses yet, only exploration licenses at this stage. Anyway, that's the seabed, but I think what you're referring to more is the water column between that and the surface. And it's always been a stupid situation that, you've got a little shrimp sitting on the bottom here. He's living in a very well-governed part of the world. He jumps 6 inches and he's into a pirate zone, because that's what it is. The high seas is still a pirate zone. Everything outside of the 200 EEZs is the high seas, and that's the majority of the planet. So the good news there is that after many years of the sort of UN carry-on that you're referring to, finally in December last month, there was an agreement that we will now proceed to what is called the BBNJ conference, which is biodiversity beyond national jurisdictions. So this is the high seas. Now that first conference happens in September 2018. It'll be 3 years.
So, sorry, this is a dumb question, I should know this, but how much of the Arctic water mass is in this high seas category?
And this is a dumb answer because I should know that.
Hands up, there's lots of experts in the room. Who can answer that? Very limited. So actually most of the Arctic waters are coastal states' territory, so to speak.
But can I just add one dimension to that? And that is, I think that shrimp example is a wonderful one. But about these plastic mountains out there.
Yeah.
There's no way we're going to collect them simply by gentle measures. When and how are we going to make that an incentive, that collecting that plastic, recycling it, turning it into something else which can be used in this resource-poor world, will be attractive? I think that is really a governance challenge. You know, how can you make that? I mean, we see it in the Norwegian setting. How can we make our fishing industry offer them at port a deposit mechanism where they can deliver what they have, picked up? And there will be somebody there who will say, we will do that, and we will make money on doing something with that waste. That can be done by a coastal state along our coast. But how can we attack those huge challenges there beyond our reach? That, I think, is a global issue, which we should be optimistic. It can be solved, but it really requires
absolutely. When you look at the challenges before us, the man-made things like overfishing or marine pollution are the easy ones to fix. It's more the climate change ones like ocean acidification and warming, which are the hard ones. But on plastic, be aware that the fundament of life has already been permeated by plastic. Microfauna is, whether you're at the bottom of the Mariana Trench or you're up in the Arctic, microfauna has microfibers from our synthetic clothing already in its gut. Yeah. And that's pervasive. The question is,
stop it getting worse.
We can stop it getting worse, and the obvious start is to get rid of single-use plastics, absolutely ban it. Rwanda and Kenya can do it, why can't the rest of us do it? And then we have to think about recycling and stopping plastic getting in the ocean in the first place, and that's all doable.
Yeah, Anya, what did you wanted to...
Well, I just wanted to follow up on that because I think it's a really interesting issue of incentivizing how to actually get the plastic out of the oceans. But it's also a question of it's a question of design. How do we design our new products? How do businesses, many of them are here today, have you gone through your supply chain looking at what are your inputs? Where do you use plastic? Where can you reduce it? Where can you exchange it with a different product? I mean, we've recently seen the UN come together with a zero vision for plastic in the ocean. What will be the businesses, their role in reaching this goal? How will they change their business models? And when I was talking about earlier the whole issue of climate risk, it's quite related because it's a question of what you put into your business to create value. You need to look at what you put in and what comes out. And I believe in a few years' time, people. I mean, we've seen in Norway just the past year, there was this stranded whale and research had opened up its gut and it was filled with plastic. And it's created a wave of involvement from the Norwegian public. And we will see this not only on plastic, I believe it's going to come on a whole range of issues. And as businesses, as investors, as politicians, you will see that this is going to happen on so many areas. And we the people, if I may, we are going to demand you to change the way you've been doing things up until now. Bravo. So you better just jump on that wagon and yeah.
Yeah, good. Well put. We've got time. Well, we haven't really, but anyway, I will
Can
allow.
Can I make one quick plastic point? I'm right here.
Where are you?
Right here.
Oh, there you are. You've got
Just to follow up really quickly before that, and there can be one more question, but the businesses, so the cost of waste management has been externalized from companies. So that's the other thing that, to follow up on what you said about businesses looking at their value chain. So if you are, and that's what the growth we're seeing in the Arctic, I'm reading about people eating more packaged food. So there's more packaging. And so companies have been able to externalize that cost to communities. I think there needs to be more responsibility by companies who are distributing materials that
Sure, but the
create
company would
waste
say,
management.
if we internalize it, we simply raise our cost to the consumer at the cash-out till. So
Right, and I've seen really, really high prices for groceries in the Arctic as well.
Yeah.
So obviously that's a problem, but I think that the responsibility needs to be shared. The communities have been burdened by this and not been able to manage it.
Yeah, all right, good point. Right, well, we don't have time, but never mind. We'll just squeeze one more in if there is one. So don't be shy. Raise your hand if you've got one last. That's good. We always get one golden ticket winner. So last, it's got to be quick though, because we're busting the schedule here. So.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussions. I'm a PhD student from Russia, and what I see is that in Russia actually we don't have that much of the discussion about the plastic pollution.
Right.
It just starts, and it starts in the maybe big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow, and maybe some of you know how we involved in this dialogue, maybe on the higher level for the Arctic Council or some other panels or forums, I don't know.
Yes, well,
because I haven't heard it, and I'm really interested in the
it's great to hear your
environmental
voice, to get
Yeah.
a sort of Russian input, or just consider where Russia stands in some of these debates.
I'd like to answer that question because I think, as I said, I believe that Norway's experience in collaborating with Russia in the north and in the Arctic is is a good example that we can show to the rest of the world, managing fish, managing our borders, creating borders, respecting borders. But what I think Russia could learn from other countries is the long chain of public involvement. Because as we just heard, this plastic issue in my country has a link between politicians waking up, business waking up, and people waking up. So you have school classes say that, we don't want plastic in at our shores, and they will clean up their local community. And when you put together those local communities and that public engagement, which I think is Russia's big challenge, allowing public engagement from bottom up, it's not a danger to Mr. Putin or anybody else, let it flow, then it will happen. Then it will happen. But you have to change that culture.
Yeah, well, I like that. It's the engagement at all levels. Politicians, business, people, all committed.
Key.
All right, ladies and gents, we run out of time. Our clock has gone red, which means we've overrun. So I don't quite know what comes next. I think a coffee break, which is probably good news. But before we go anywhere, please give a very, very big thank you to our panel. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.